They say the walls still breathe at night. In Charleston's low country, when the tide creeps up the marshes and the cicadas scream like souls trapped in hot air, locals swear they can hear crying from beneath the roots of the old Tane estate, a plantation so cursed that even time pretends it never existed. What you're about to hear was never meant for the public. The records were sealed, the journals burned. The families who knew paid to forget. Because this isn't just a story about slavery. It's a story about breeding, about a woman who turned her bloodline into a machine for profit and her daughters into instruments of creation and control. In 1838, a widow named Eleanor Lena Tane ruled over her plantation like a queen without a crown. To Charleston's elite, she was a miracle, a woman who prospered after her husband's death, whose fields overflowed, whose slaves never rebelled, whose daughters were the image of Southern grace. But behind the curtains of her immaculate drawing rooms, behind her Sunday charity and whispered prayers, there stood another house, hidden by the oaks, shuttered from view. The breeding house. Inside it, women were not women. They were vessels. Their bodies were catalogued like livestock, their children pre-priced before birth. The ledgers called it increase. The traders called it stock improvement. But to Eleanor, it was legacy. You see, her late husband, Colonel William Tane, had once studied eugenics under European physicians who claimed they could engineer superior human traits through selective pairings. He died before proving his theory, but his widow finished the work. Only she went further. She bred her slaves, and when the bloodlines grew weak, she used her own daughters to continue the experiment. The eldest, Caroline, was loyal, the mother's reflection in will and cruelty. Josephine was curious, dangerous in her awe, Barness. The youngest, Beatrice, still innocent enough to fear what she didn't yet understand. The year 1838 would mark the final phase of Eleanor's project, the one she believed would perfect not just her estate, but the Southern race itself. But secrets buried in flesh have a way of clawing their way to the surface. And it would take one man, a slave named Isaiah, newly purchased from Virginia, to light the match that burned Charleston's illusion of civility to ash. He came looking for his sister. What he found was a system so calculated, so monstrous, that it defied even hell's imagination. The storm that broke that summer was not born from the sky. It came from within the house itself, from guilt, from blood, from the screams of children born to chains. And before this night is over, you'll understand why Charleston buried the name Tane forever. Because the evil of that widow wasn't merely cruelty, it was science, dressed in lace and scripture. So sit still, breathe slowly, and listen carefully. Because every word that follows was once considered treason against polite history. By 1838, Eleanor Tane had mastered the art of invisibility. Her cruelty never bared its teeth in public. It smiled, poured tea, and quoted scripture. To the men of Charleston, she was proof that a woman could rule an empire without lifting her voice. To the enslaved who lived under her roof, she was something else entirely. A god in human form, one who decided who would live, who would breed, and who would vanish before sunrise. Inside her study, Eleanor's world was not emotion. It was mathematics. Each birth recorded, each body valued, each child weighed in coin before it drew its first breath. Her plantation was not run on crops alone. It was built upon genetic profit, a breeding system so efficient it made her neighbors call her the widow who never starves. She smiled when they said it, knowing none of them would ever grasp how literal those words were. To Eleanor, the enslaved were a resource too unstable, too human. They tired, they aged, they died. But their blood could be controlled. Through the right pairings, she believed, one could craft the perfect field hand, obedient yet strong, tireless yet silent. It wasn't a fantasy born from madness, but from the philosophy whispered through European salons, the idea that some bloodlines were born to rule and others to serve. That belief had infected Charleston like perfume masking rot, and Eleanor was its high priestess. Each of her daughters was an extension of her grand design. Caroline, the eldest, precise, composed, and cold, oversaw the infirmary records. She understood the arithmetic of breeding, which women conceived easily, which men produced the strongest offspring. Josephine, restless and brilliant, wrote in secret. She documented everything, every birth, every death, every act that her mother hid behind locked doors. Her ink was the conscience of a house without one. And Beatrice, the youngest, she was still being prepared. The family believed they were purifying their legacy. But the truth was simpler. Eleanor was manufacturing bloodlines, selling human children as one would sell horses, each generation calibrated for yield. Then Charleston's church turned its eyes away, because Eleanor donated generously to God, and God, it seemed, preferred gold to justice. There were rumors, of course, whispers from field hands, drunken merchants, even a physician who fled town after seeing what passed for medicine at Tane Plantation, but whispers dissolve quickly in a world built on silence. And yet, one whisper did not fade. It came from a young man named Isaiah, newly bought from Virginia, whose sister had been transferred to Tane months prior. He had heard stories in the slave markets, stories of a house where women were bred like animals, their children sold as new stock. He didn't believe them, until he saw the house for himself. Behind the mansion's glowing windows stood a structure with black shutters, always closed. It reeked of herbs and blood. At night, candles burned within, silhouettes moving like phantoms behind the drapes. The slaves called it the second womb. It was there that Eleanor's true work lived and died. Each dawn, the overseer, Silas Webb, delivered reports to the widow. Subject 23, healthy. Subject 9, terminated. His tone was medical, detached. To him, they weren't people. They were inventory. Eleanor's only reply was her pen scratching against parchment, noting values beside each name. She was creating a system, not of slavery, that already existed, of control. She believed that by controlling the birth, one could control the rebellion. That if you bred fear into the bone, obedience became heredity. A generation of slaves who would never rise because resistance would never occur to them. That was her genius and her damnation. One evening, during a dinner with Charleston's judges and plantation owners, Eleanor toasted her success. "The good Lord," she said, "gives seed to the sower, but the wise woman tends the soil herself." They applauded her wit. None realized they had just applauded God's work, rewritten in her image. But the seeds she planted would not grow into profit alone. They would grow into ghosts, and those ghosts would not stay buried. There are houses where silence weighs more than walls, and the Tane mansion was one of them. It was a structure of symmetry and deceit, designed to convince the world of its grace while concealing the disease that pulsed inside its heart. In that house, Eleanor Tane's 3 daughters learned early that obedience was survival and silence was love. Caroline, the eldest, had inherited her mother's composure. She walked through the house like a ghost with perfect posture, her hair pinned, her lips unmoving except to command. Her hands never trembled when she signed orders for more women to be transferred to the infirmary, never flinched when she approved medical procedures that other families whispered about but never dared confirm. Caroline believed what her mother taught her, that the world was built on blood, and the wise ensured it flowed in their favor. Josephine was different. Where Caroline hid her thoughts, Josephine's mind was a fire no upbringing could smother. She saw the contradictions that others ignored, the sermons about mercy spoken by men who traded human beings, the genteel laughter of her mother's friends as they toasted to progress built on chained backs. Late at night, when the house grew still and the wind pressed against the shutters, Josephine would pull up a loose floorboard and retrieve her journal. There, by candlelight, she wrote what no one dared speak: the truth of her mother's empire, the names of the women in the infirmary, the details of the experiments performed in secrecy. The journal became her confession and her curse, for she knew that if anyone ever found it, she would vanish like so many others, yet she could not stop. Her conscience had become a weapon that turned inward. Beatrice, the youngest, lived in the shadow of her sisters and the tightening plans of her mother. At 17, she still carried a softness that had not yet been stripped away. Her mother's eyes followed her constantly, during meals, at church, even in her sleep. Preparations had begun for her 18th birthday, though she did not understand what it meant beyond dresses, etiquette lessons, and quiet visits from Dr. Parnell, whose clinical smile made her skin crawl. When she asked Josephine why she was being examined so often, her sister's answers grew evasive. When she asked Caroline, she received only one sentence in return: "You will soon serve the family." The family. That word was holy in the Taine household. It excused everything. It justified cruelty as duty, manipulation as love, and obedience as virtue. Even the daughters were tools in the widow's design. Caroline had become her executor, Josephine her chronicler, and Beatrice her next experiment. The lines between blood and property blurred until no one in the house could tell where family ended and possession began. The nights grew longer that summer. Storms rolled in from the coast, shaking the windows, and with each rumble of thunder, Josephine's fear deepened. She could no longer ignore the muffled cries that drifted from the grove beyond the gardens where the breeding house stood. She had tried to believe the story her mother told the townspeople, that it was merely an infirmary for sick servants. But she had seen the women herself through a cracked shutter, their bellies swollen, their eyes vacant, their wrists bound to the bedposts. Dr. Parnell called it medical supervision. Eleanor called it management. Josephine called it hell. Her chance encounter with Isaiah, the new house servant, changed everything. He was unlike the others, too alert, too controlled. When their eyes met during a dinner service, she recognized something dangerous in his gaze: purpose. Later, when she found a note slipped beneath her chamber door, written in rough but careful hand: "Do you know what happens in the house beyond the trees?" She realized she was not the only one keeping secrets. For the first time, Josephine felt the possibility of rebellion. But rebellion came at a cost. In Charleston, whispers could kill as swiftly as knives. A rumor could destroy a reputation, and for women of status, that meant ruin beyond repair. Josephine knew her mother's power did not come from wealth alone. It came from leverage, letters, debts, and the loyalty of men too frightened or too guilty to oppose her. Even the church deferred to her donations. The plantation owners who praised her efficiency in public also feared her in private. She owned their sins on paper. Eleanor's mastery of control extended to psychology. She trained her daughters through affection measured like rationed bread, small doses of approval that created dependence. When Josephine defied her, Eleanor did not raise her voice. She smiled, touched her cheek, and whispered, "You mistake freedom for virtue, my dear. Freedom is the luxury of those who have not been chosen to lead." That phrase haunted Josephine more than any punishment could. In the summer of 1838, a guest arrived who would accelerate the collapse of the Taine dynasty. Lieutenant James Blackwood, a young officer whose family owned neighboring fields. Eleanor welcomed him under the guise of social courtesy, but her intentions were far more strategic. He was strong, educated, and came from impeccable line. Age. To her, he was not a man. He was potential stock. His blood, she believed, could purify her line further. She invited him to dine, to tour the estate, to speak of agriculture and progress. And beneath it all, she studied him, like one studies a specimen. That night, as the rain lashed against the windows, Beatrice stood at the edge of her bed, trembling. Josephine entered her room without knocking. "We need to talk," she said in a hushed voice, "about Mother, about what she's preparing you for." Beatrice tried to deny it, but tears betrayed her. She already knew enough to be terrified. She had overheard fragments of conversation between Eleanor and Dr. Parnell, phrases about lineage, compatibility, and the continuation of the superior strain. Her 18th birthday, she now understood, was not a celebration. It was an initiation. Josephine pressed a hand over her sister's mouth before she could cry out. "Listen to me," she whispered. Caroline knows. She's helping Mother. But we can stop this. There's one of the new servants. He's looking for a woman held in the infirmary. If he's right, there are others. If we can prove it, if we can get his sister out, we can expose Mother for what she's done." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Expose her to who?" she asked. Josephine hesitated, realizing she had no answer. The law belonged to Eleanor. The men of Charleston drank her wine, the priests accepted her gifts, and even the sheriff's uniform was stitched from her coin. Still, Josephine said, "Then we'll expose her to God." It was a desperate, childish thing to say, but in that house of moral rot, it was the only kind of justice left. Outside, lightning split the sky, and in the brief illumination, Josephine saw her own reflection in the mirror behind Beatrice, eyes dark with resolve, face pale as confession. She no longer looked like a daughter, she looked like a witness. That night, as thunder rolled over the coast and the air thickened with the smell of rain, Isaiah crept through the servants' quarters toward the hidden passage beneath the wash-house. In his hand was a small key given by an old woman who whispered, "If you're caught, none of us will see morning." Every step brought him closer to the truth he feared, and the sister he prayed was still alive. The breeding house awaited him beyond the grove, shrouded in shadow and secrecy, its windows dark, its door locked from within. Inside, Dr. Parnell's instruments gleamed under lamplight. The smell of antiseptic and iron filled the air. Somewhere, a woman sobbed softly, her voice breaking the illusion of scientific calm. And above them all, in the main house, Eleanor Taine sipped her wine and listened to the storm, her reflection shimmering in the glass like a spirit unafraid of damnation. The widow of Charleston had created her own kingdom, built on obedience, sealed by fear, and bound by blood. But cracks had begun to form, not in her walls, but in her daughters. And when bloodlines crack, the collapse is never quiet. It begins with whispers, then screams, and finally, fire. The storm was at its height when Isaiah crossed the courtyard, rain soaking through his torn shirt, lightning illuminating the world in short, violent flashes. He moved with purpose, each step driven by a prayer he no longer knew how to speak. The key Phyllis had given him was small, rusted, almost delicate in his palm, a fragile thing against the iron cruelty of the place it opened. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, the breeding house rose from the grove like a tomb, pretending to be a home. It was whitewashed, elegant in design, its shutters closed tight. To anyone else it might have looked like an infirmary, a place of healing, but Isaiah Nays knew better. The walls of that building did not heal, they consumed. When he reached the back door, he hesitated. From inside came faint sounds, a metallic clink, a woman's low moan, the scrape of something being moved. He inserted the key, turning it slowly until he felt the lock give way. The hinges creaked, and for a moment he froze, waiting for the shout of an overseer. None came, only the steady hum of rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. He slipped inside. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Not rot, exactly, but a thick mixture of blood, medicine, and milk. It was the scent of birth and death sharing the same breath. The corridor was narrow, lined with doors on both sides. Each one was marked by a small brass plate and a number. From behind one door came the faint cry of an infant. From another, the heavy breathing of someone in pain. He moved quietly, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. He passed a window covered by curtains so heavy no light could enter. Underneath one of them, a small streak of crimson stained the fabric. He reached the third door and pushed it open. Inside, a young woman sat on a chair near the window, her arms cradling a newborn child. Her skin glistened with fever. Her hair clung to her face in damp curls. When she looked up, her eyes were empty. Not with fear, but with something worse. Acceptance. Isaiah whispered her name before he could stop himself. Ruth. For a heartbeat, The world stopped. Her eyes flickered with faint recognition, then widened. "Isaiah!" Her voice cracked on the second syllable, fragile and unbelieving. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside the chair. She was thinner than he remembered, her wrists marked by restraints, her belly still swollen from recent birth. The baby whimpered softly, unaware of the reunion that time and cruelty had nearly erased. "We have to go," Isaiah whispered, his hand trembling. "Now, before they find you." But she shook her head, eyes darting toward the door. "They're watching," she said. "Always watching, even when you think you're alone." She nodded toward the corner, where he noticed a small panel cut into the wall. A hidden observation window, shuttered from the other side. They see everything. They record everything. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow, deliberate, too confident to belong to another slave. He ducked behind a cabinet just as the door opened. Dr. Parnell entered, followed by Nurse Hammond, carrying a tray of instruments that clattered softly. "Vitals," the doctor said, adjusting his spectacles. The nurse moved toward Ruth with mechanical obedience, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Pulse strong," she said flatly. "Infant feeding well." Parnell nodded, jotting notes into a leather-bound journal. "Good. Mrs. Taine expects this one ready for the next cycle by winter." His tone was calm, conversational, as though discussing crop rotation. Ruth's lips trembled. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." The doctor didn't respond. He simply noted, "Subject 23, resistance declining. Recommend mild tonic to maintain compliance." Isaiah's nails dug into his palms as he fought the urge to strike. He had seen cruelty before, but not this. Not science turned into ritual. When the doctor and nurse left, Ruth clutched Isaiah's sleeve. "You can't save me," she whispered. "But you can save them." She nodded toward the corridor. "There are others. Some with child. Some taken before their time. They think they own the blood. They think they can shape it." She paused, her voice trembling. "They used her too." "Who?" Isaiah demanded. But she only looked toward the ceiling, tears running down her face. "The daughter," she said softly. "The youngest one. They say she will bear the next generation. She doesn't know. She thinks it's for love." Isaiah felt the room spin. The realization hit him like a hammer. Eleanor's cruelty had reached her own children. The bloodline experiments were not just about slaves. They were about her family. About merging what she considered pure with what she considered useful. It was a new form of ownership, one that fused power, race, and inheritance into a single monstrous equation. He knew then that there was no freedom for Ruth, not while the Taine estate stood. The only way to save her, to save anyone, was to destroy the house itself. But how? As he slipped back into the corridor, he heard voices approaching. One was unmistakably Eleanor's. Cold, commanding, the tone of a woman used to obedience. "You've done well, Doctor," she said. "The results are consistent. I believe we've nearly perfected the balance. Soon, the Blackwood blood will be introduced." Parnell hesitated. "Are you sure, madam? It's unconventional." Eleanor's reply was ice. Progress is always unconventional. From a slit between the doors, Isaiah saw them pass. Eleanor in a dark dress that glimmered like oil, her expression serene, her eyes empty of doubt. She paused beside one of the rooms, listening to the muffled cries within. "You hear that?" she said softly. "That is the sound of the future being born. The North may have its factories, but here we build something purer, something eternal." Isaiah waited until they were gone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. When the hall fell silent again, he turned back toward Ruth's room. But it was too late. The nurse had returned. The cradle was empty. Ruth was gone. Only a blood-stained cloth lay folded on the chair. He picked it up with shaking hands, realizing that mercy and horror often looked the same in that house. He fled through the passage, emerging into the storm. The air outside felt like freedom for a single heartbeat, until he saw figures moving by lantern light across the field. Overseers, dogs, the gleam of gunmetal. Someone had sounded the alarm. He didn't know how, but they knew. He ran toward the slave quarters, clutching the key and the cloth like relics of a dying faith. Behind him, lightning struck the grove, setting fire to a tree that exploded in a shower of sparks. For a moment, it illuminated the mansion, tall, perfect, and monstrous. In that flash, he saw Eleanor Taine standing on the veranda, her silhouette framed against the storm. She was not afraid. She was smiling, because in her mind, everything, even rebellion, was part of her design. She believed no one could destroy what was born in blood. She was wrong. Morning came grey and heavy, the kind of sky that presses down on a place until it forgets how to breathe. The fire in the grove had burned out by dawn, leaving the air thick with smoke and ash. The breeding house still stood, blackened at its edges, like a body that had survived its own cremation. The slaves whispered of lightning, but Eleanor knew better. Fire does not strike by chance on land cursed by conscience. She watched from the veranda, unmoved, her eyes following the thin plumes rising between the trees. To her, it was not destruction. It was purification. Nature had simply cleansed the excess, leaving her design intact. Downstairs, Dr. Parnell was already at work. His hands shook slightly as he sorted through damaged ledgers, the ink bled by rain and soot. "Some of the specimens were lost," he said quietly. Eleanor didn't respond. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Loss," she said finally, "is the cost of improvement." She turned back to him, her expression serene. "The work continues." It always continued. Nothing, not fire, not faith, not fear, could interrupt the rhythm she had built. That morning she ordered the infirmary relocated to the basement of the main house. "Discretion," she explained, "is the soul of innovation." To Charleston society, it was another act of resilience by a widow determined to preserve her husband's legacy. To those inside the estate, it was the tightening of a noose. But in private, Eleanor's ambitions had evolved. What began as an economic venture had become something far greater, a vision. She no longer spoke of breeding slaves for profit. She spoke of refining the blood of creation. Her journals, written in an elegant, almost obsessive script, outlined theories that merged theology, biology, and control. She believed humanity could be improved not through education or morality, but through selective manipulation of bloodlines, through the deliberate cultivation of divine traits. She had read of it in European papers smuggled through the ports of Charleston, ideas whispered in medical academies about perfecting mankind. Most dismissed them as pseudoscience or madness. Eleanor did not. To her, it was revelation. "God creates," she wrote, "but man perfects." And so she experimented, quietly, methodically, and without remorse. Every slave pregnancy was documented in her private ledger, not just by mother and father, but by physical characteristics, temperament, and output. She adjusted pairings the way others adjusted crop rotations, searching for combinations that produced the desired results. But that was only the beginning. Her true experiment began when she turned inward, when she began using her own bloodline as material. The first trials involved her eldest daughter, Caroline. At 19, she was married briefly to a planter's son who died under uncertain circumstances. No one questioned it. Illness was a convenient word in polite society. What no one knew was that before his death, Eleanor had demanded access to his blood, his medical records, even his personal effects. When his body was buried, Eleanor sent for Dr. Parnell. They recorded everything. Caroline was never seen grieving. She merely returned to her duties, pale and efficient. Josephine, meanwhile, had discovered one of her mother's journals hidden inside a locked chest. The entries detailed more than plantation business. They spoke of the project of purity, the unification of European discipline and African vigor. Each line made her stomach twist. Her mother wrote not as a woman, but as a god dissecting creation itself. And at the bottom of one page, Josephine found her own name, along with a chilling note. Her intellect is strong but restless, possibly suited for the second phase. Observe responses under controlled emotional stress. That night, Josephine confronted Caroline. "You knew," she said. "You've always known." Caroline's silence was confirmation enough. "Do you even care?" Josephine demanded. Caroline's reply was calm, almost gentle. "Mother is building something that will outlive us all. You think in feelings, she thinks in centuries." Josephine wanted to strike her. Instead, she turned away, her heart pounding with a new kind of rage, the kind born not from fear, but from awakening. She realized that the house, the estate, the entire system around them wasn't just built on power, it was built to erase humanity itself. Every act of obedience fed it, every silence protected it, every lie refined it. And Beatrice? She was next. The youngest daughter, with her soft laughter and delicate hands, was being groomed for a role she couldn't yet comprehend. Her mother had begun speaking of legacy marriages, of unions not for love, but for lineage. She spoke of Lieutenant James Blackwood with unnerving familiarity, describing his family's excellent traits. Beatrice had blushed, mistaking it for matchmaking. She didn't realize she had already been chosen, long before she was even born. Eleanor's obsession with perfection extended to herself. In her private mirror, she saw not a woman aging, but a species evolving. The lines on her face, the grey in her hair, they were symptoms of the old world, imperfections she would erase through her descendants. She believed her daughters were vessels for a higher inheritance, each selected, each measured. But she failed to see what was forming beneath her own roof: resistance. Isaiah had escaped the grove that night, barely alive, his hands burned, his body cut. He hid among the marshes, watching the mansion from afar. He saw lights flickering in the basement, the faint glow of oil lamps through narrow windows. He could hear the faint cries, even from a distance. He knew Ruth was gone, but her words remained. They used her too. For days he waited, gathering scraps of information from sympathetic slaves who whispered his name like a curse and a prayer. Through them, he learned of Josephine, the daughter who wrote, the one who asked questions, the one who didn't look away. Slowly, a fragile alliance began to form between the unseen and the unphrased. Meanwhile, Eleanor planned her most audacious step, the union of Beatrice and Lieutenant Blackwood, a marriage that would merge her carefully cultivated bloodline with what she called the purest Anglo-Saxon virtue. The ceremony would be small, private, for family only. It would also mark the final phase of her experiment. But something had begun to shift in her daughters. Caroline's composure had begun to crack, tiny fractures spreading through her poise like veins in marble. She had started drinking at night, staring into the dark with eyes that no longer saw purpose, only ghosts. Josephine grew bolder, moving through the house like a shadow, gathering evidence for a truth no one would believe. And Beatrice began to dream, terrible, vivid dreams of children crying in rooms without light, of her mother's voice reciting scripture while holding a scalpel. The Tain estate had become a living organism, breathing, watching, waiting. Every heartbeat in that house was a secret trying to escape. The night before Beatrice's 18th birthday, Eleanor wrote a single line in her private journal: "Tomorrow, the blood unites." But by then, her creation was already rotting from the inside. The morning of Beatrice's 18th birthday dawned deceptively serene. The air was crisp after a night of rain, and sunlight filtered through the hanging moss, gilding the Tain estate in a false aura of grace. The house smelled of polished wood and lilies, and the servants moved quietly, their faces expressionless, but their eyes wary. The widow of Charleston was in her element. Every ribbon, every glass, every petal had been placed by her instruction. To anyone who looked upon the scene, it was an image of southern dignity. But beneath the surface, a storm of a different kind had begun to stir, one not born of weather, but of revelation. Josephine had not slept. Her journal lay open before her, its pages trembling under the weight of candle, light, and fear. She had spent the entire night copying entries from her mother's ledger, every date, every name, every notation that tied Eleanor Taine to the breeding program. There were hundreds of them, names of women sold, children born, pairings ordered, and payments recorded in cold, elegant ink. Each word was a blade, and Josephine had sharpened them all. Her plan was simple, but desperate. She would hide her journal and smuggle a copy of the ledger to Charleston's abolitionist network through a merchant she trusted. They would not believe her at first. How could they? But the evidence would be undeniable. It was the only way to end it. She knew she was risking her life. But when she thought of the women she had seen in the infirmary, of Isaiah's haunted eyes, of Beatrice trembling in her sleep as their mother prepared her for the Union, she realized she no longer cared whether she lived through the day. Truth had become her only purpose. Downstairs, Eleanor's voice floated through the hall like the low hum of a hymn. "We are gathered to celebrate continuity," she said to the few guests assembled, Judge Hile, the Reverend Morrison, and Lieutenant James Blackwood, among others. "Our family stands as proof that discipline and devotion can overcome any trial. The world changes, but virtue endures." Her words dripped with sanctity, yet each syllable masked corruption. None of the men present noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she lifted her glass, or the flicker of paranoia in her eyes. Eleanor Taine was a woman who trusted no one, not even her own blood. She had grown aware of Josephine's restlessness. The girl's curiosity had become too pointed, her silence too heavy. For weeks, Eleanor had instructed the overseer to monitor her movements. She even had her chambers searched. But Josephine was careful. The journal was hidden behind a false panel in the wall, a trick she had learned from her late father's study. What Eleanor did not know was that her own words had already been copied, sealed and concealed beneath the loose floorboard in the servants' quarters, where Isaiah now hid. Caroline, meanwhile, had begun to unravel. That morning, she stared at her reflection for nearly an hour, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot. She could no longer tell where her mother's will ended and her own began. She remembered every order she had carried out, every woman transferred, every document signed. She told herself she had done it for duty, for family, but the truth whispered differently in her mind. It told her she had done it for power, for her mother's approval, for the illusion of being chosen. Now, as she prepared for the ceremony that would bind Beatrice to the Blackwood heir, she felt nothing but nausea. Beatrice herself was quiet, too quiet. Her face was powdered, her hair braided in gold ribbon, her gown pale ivory. She looked like a bride carved from marble, yet inside, she was breaking. The night before, she had read a few pages of Josephine's journal when her sister had fallen asleep. The words had scarred her, descriptions of the breeding house, of her mother's obsession, of the planned experiment that would begin after her wedding. There was even mention of her name, Beatrice, beside phrases like new generation and unification phase. The meaning was clear enough to turn her blood to ice. By mid-afternoon, the guests gathered in the parlor. The atmosphere was thick with unease disguised as politeness. Lieutenant Blackwood stood tall and handsome, unaware of the nightmare he was about to enter. He believed he was courting an heiress. He didn't realize he was being chosen as a component. Josephine Slee upped from the stairs and into the hall. In her hand she carried her journal wrapped in plain cloth. She intended to leave it in the carriage house for Isaiah, who would deliver it to Charleston by nightfall. But as she reached the door, she froze. Eleanor stood there, blocking her path, her face calm, but her eyes gleaming with quiet fury. "Going somewhere, my dear?" Josephine's mouth went dry. I needed air." Eleanor stepped closer, her presence cold and overwhelming. "You've been restless lately, distracted, writing, wandering, asking questions. You remind me of your father when he thought he could play God without discipline." Her hand moved toward the bundle in Josephine's grip. "What are you holding?" Josephine took a step back. "Just notes, sketches. Then show me." In that moment, Josephine knew the truth. There was no lie that could save her. The only way forward was through fire. "You want to see?" she said, her voice trembling. "Then read what you've created." She threw the bundle at her mother's feet. The cloth unraveled, revealing the journal. Pages fluttered open, each one filled with Eleanor's crimes in her daughter's handwriting. The silence that followed was alive, electric. Eleanor's face did not move, but her eyes darkened. "Do you think this," she gestured to the pages, "changes anything? You think anyone will believe a hysterical girl over the widow who feeds half the county? You think you can wound me with truth?" Her voice dropped to a whisper that chilled the air. "I am truth." Josephine's reply was barely a breath. "Your decay." The slap came so fast she didn't feel it at first. Then came the sting, the metallic taste of blood. Eleanor leaned close, her voice almost tender. "Do not mistake rebellion for righteousness, child. Righteousness builds, rebellion destroys." Behind them, Caroline had entered the hall. She had heard everything. For the first time, she saw her mother not as a figure of strength, but as something hollow, a machine fueled by fear. Her hands shook as she whispered, "Mother, stop." Eleanor turned, her face softening. "Caroline, my darling, you of all people understand." "I understand that you've damned us all." The words struck harder than any blow. Eleanor's composure fractured. Her daughters had become witnesses, and witnesses were dangerous. She looked between them, her mind already calculating. "You leave me no choice," she said. "The blood must correct itself." Upstairs, Beatrice stood before the mirror, her heart pounding. She could hear the voices below, the rising argument, the tremor of chaos long suppressed. She no longer felt fear, only clarity. The house that had raised her was not a home, it was a laboratory of madness, and she was next in its line of experiments. She reached into her drawer, pulled out a silver hairpin, and gripped it tightly in her hand like a weapon. Outside, the sky darkened again, thunder rolling across the marshes. The air inside the mansion grew thick, heavy, alive with the sense that something ancient and terrible was about to break. In that moment, every secret in the Tane estate began to converge. The journal, the sisters, the servant hiding in the shadows, the mother's pride, and the storm that refused to pass. By nightfall, someone would be dead. Evening fell like a wound. The sun sank behind the cypress trees, and the world turned copper and black, as though the light itself feared to linger over what was about to unfold. Inside the Tane mansion, the mirrors had been covered for the ceremony, a custom Eleanor insisted upon, claiming that reflections distracted the soul from duty. But everyone in that house knew the real reason. Mirrors show truth, and truth had no place in this house tonight. The candles burned low in the parlor. The guests had been dismissed under the pretense of an unexpected illness, leaving only family and a few servants who were too afraid to look directly at their mistress. Outside, thunder rolled like the growl of something vast and unseen. Eleanor stood by the grand piano, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression cold and composed. Across the room, Josephine leaned against the banister, one side of her face still red from her mother's slap. Caroline stood beside the fireplace, trembling, her glass of wine untouched. Beatrice descended the staircase in silence, her ivory gown pale against the gathering dark. The air between them was dense, heavy, waiting for something to ignite. "Sit," Eleanor said, her voice measured, almost calm. The three daughters obeyed out of habit rather than will. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the crackle of lightning filled the pause between breaths. Then Eleanor began to speak, not to explain, but to justify. "Do you know what this world is without discipline?" she asked. "Chaos, decay, weakness. I have spent my life building order from chaos. I have preserved what your father began, his vision, his science, his faith. I have ensured that our blood remains strong, while others squander theirs in sin and ignorance." Josephine's voice broke the silence. "You call this faith? You bred women like cattle. You used your own children. You think you're preserving life, but you've murdered something far greater." Her tone shook with fury and despair. "You've murdered the soul." Eleanor turned her gaze on her. "The soul is a luxury for the powerless," she said. "You still believe in innocence, but innocence is a lie men tell themselves before they are broken. You cannot lead a world. You refuse to shape." Caroline's voice, quiet but shaking, followed. "Mother, the things we've done, the women we've harmed, how can that be shaping anything? How can that be divine?" She set the wineglass down hard enough to shatter it. "You taught me to believe in legacy. But what legacy is this? Fear? Blood? Bones?" For the first time in her life, Eleanor seemed to falter. A flicker of exhaustion passed through her eyes, an almost human moment of vulnerability, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You sound like your father," she said, her tone sharp. "He too lost his conviction. He believed sentiment could redeem science. It destroyed him." Josephine froze. "You said he died of fever." Eleanor smiled faintly. "A fever of conscience," she said. "I ended it before it could infect the rest of us." The words hit like a blade. Beatrice's knees nearly gave out. Caroline pressed a hand to her mouth. Josephine whispered, "You killed him." Eleanor's calm did not waver. "I completed his work. Death is only failure when it lacks purpose." He became weak, distracted by pity. "I gave him peace, and I gave you strength." The thunder outside cracked like judgment. For a moment the room went dark as the storm swallowed the last light. When it flickered back, Josephine was crying, not with sorrow, but with fury. "You don't understand," she said through her tears. "You think you've created something eternal, but you've built it on pain, on theft, on the backs of those you call lesser. You've built it on sin, and sin doesn't last. It rots everything it touches, including you." Eleanor took a step forward, her eyes glowing in the candlelight. "You dare to lecture me? You, who have lived in comfort bought by the very system you now condemn? You eat from its table, wear its silk, breathe its air. There is no purity in rebellion, child, only hypocrisy." Behind them the door creaked open. Isaiah stepped. Head inside, soaked from the rain, his clothes torn, his face lit by rage and grief. In his hands he held the remains of the burned ledger, the pages he had found scattered near the grove. "There's no more hiding," he said quietly. "The world will know what you did here." Eleanor's gaze snapped toward him. "You," she hissed, as if the word itself were venom. "You should have been disposed of." Josephine moved before her mother could. "He's here because of you, because you've destroyed everything decent left in this place, because the blood you worship has drowned us all." Eleanor's expression twisted, not in fear, but in contempt. "You bring a slave into my house as judge? You bring impurity into my family's sanctum and call it righteousness?" She turned to Beatrice, who stood trembling at the foot of the stairs. "Do you see now why I never trusted them? This is what rebellion looks like, filth dressed in defiance." Beatrice's voice was soft, but it cut through the storm. "He's the only one here who still knows what it means to be human." For a moment, time stopped. The widow of Charleston stared at her youngest child as if she were an insect daring to speak. "You ungrateful girl," she whispered. "You were meant to carry the future of this house. And now you stand there, defending the ruin of everything your blood has achieved." Beatrice took a step forward, her voice shaking. "If this is the future, I don't want it." Eleanor's eyes filled with something darker than rage, fear. For the first time her control was slipping. Her creation, her daughters, her empire, all defying her in unison. She moved toward the table, her hand closing around the ornate letter opener beside the ledger. "Then you leave me no choice?" she said quietly. Caroline shouted, "Mother, no!" But the motion was too fast. an instinct born of madness. Eleanor lunged toward Josephine. The steel glinted in the candlelight. In the same instant Beatrice moved, driven by pure impulse, the silver hairpin still clutched in her hand. The sound that followed was sharp, small, and final. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Eleanor staggered back, her eyes wide in disbelief. The letter opener fell from her grasp, clattering onto the marble floor. She looked down at her chest, where the silver hairpin now protruded just above her heart. Blood bloomed through her black gown like ink spreading across paper. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her gaze moved from Beatrice to Josephine, then to Caroline. And for the first time in her life, the widow of Charleston looked afraid. She sank slowly to her knees, one hand reaching for the piano for support. "You," she gasped. "You were meant to perfect me." And then she fell. The house went silent, except for the storm. Beatrice stared at her hands, trembling, covered in her mother's blood. Caroline wept, not for the woman who had died, but for the years spent worshipping her. Josephine stood still, her face streaked with tears, her breathing ragged. Isaiah moved forward, kneeling beside Eleanor's body. For all the pain she had caused, he closed her eyes with a trembling hand. "The blood ends here," he whispered. Outside, lightning split the sky, striking the old oak in the grove. The fire that followed spread quickly, devouring the remnants of the breeding house. Flames licked upward, red and gold, casting their glow across the plantation. The storm raged, but the fire refused to die. It consumed everything, the fields, the barns, the symbols of wealth and dominion. By morning, nothing would remain of the Tain Empire but ash. Inside the mansion, the daughters watched as the flames reeked, hid the windows. Josephine turned to Isaiah. "We have to leave." He nodded. Caroline helped Beatrice to her feet, her expression hollow. The four of them fled into the rain, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. Behind them, the house of blood and silence burned. It was not just wood and stone that perished that night. It was a lineage, a philosophy, a darkness disguised as order. But ashes do not always bury the past. Sometimes they preserve it. By dawn, the sky was the color of old bruises, violet, gray, and red, as if the heavens themselves were grieving what had been done. The Tain plantation, once the pride of Charleston's low country, lay in ruins. The grand house that had stood as a monument to wealth and control was now a skeleton of smouldering timbers, its white columns charred and crumbling into black dust. The fire had raged through the night, devouring the breeding house, the stables, and finally the mansion itself. When the storm passed, all that remained was silence. Josephine stood at the edge of the field, barefoot in the wet earth, her gown stained with soot and blood. Behind her, Beatrice wept quietly, her face hidden against Caroline's shoulder. Isaiah stood apart from them, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first light of morning broke through the smoke. None of them spoke. There were no words for what had been destroyed, or what had been freed. The fire had not been an accident. Isaiah had lit it before fleeing the night before, after Eleanor fell. He had used oil from the lanterns, scattering it across the grove and the wooden walls of the breeding house. He hadn't meant for the flames to reach the mansion, but the storm had carried them. Fire, like truth, does not obey boundaries once it finds air to breathe. By the time the overseers arrived with what little courage they had left, the women were gone. The few surviving slaves had fled into the marshes, taking their chance at freedom in the chaos. The dogs refused to track them. Even the animals seemed to sense that the Tain estate had become a place cursed beyond redemption. As the sun rose higher, Josephine turned to her sisters. "We can't stay," she said. Her voice was hollow, stripped of everything but determination. "If we stay, they'll come. The law, the planters. They'll rewrite what happened. They'll call it an accident. They'll bury her crimes with her body." Caroline's voice trembled. "And what do we do then? Where do we go?"
"Anywhere that isn't here," Josephine said. "Anywhere we can start over."
Beatrice looked up, her face pale but resolute.
"And the truth?" she asked. "Do we let it die too?"
Josephine met her gaze.
"No," she said quietly.
The truth doesn't die. It waits. They turned toward the river path where Isaiah had hidden a small boat before the storm. The air was heavy with the scent of burned cedar and ash. Each step away from the ruins felt like walking through the bones of their past. Caroline carried only a single object, their father's old pocket watch, retrieved from the ashes of his desk. It no longer ticked, but she kept it in her hand as if holding time itself hostage. When they reached the boat, Isaiah was already there, waiting. He had salvaged a small bundle from the wreckage, the few surviving pages of Josephine's journal, waterlogged but intact enough to tell the story. "This is all that's left," he said, "but it's enough." Josephine nodded. "We'll hide it," she said, "somewhere safe, somewhere it can be found when people are ready to hear it." The four of them pushed off into the river. The current was slow, burdened by silt and debris from the fire. The plantation receded behind them, a fading ghost, its reflection rippling on the dark water, until even that disappeared. For hours they traveled in silence. Caroline stared at the water, her expression unreadable. Beatrice held Josephine's hand, trembling whenever thunder echoed in the distance. Isaiah rowed steadily, his eyes scanning the horizon for patrols. When they finally reached the outskirts of Charleston, they stopped beneath a cluster of old willow trees. The city lay ahead, its spires and rooftops still untouched by the fire's shadow. Josephine opened her journal and tore out the first page, the one that bore the title she had written weeks earlier, "The Record of the Tane Plantation." She folded it, sealed it with wax from a nearby candle stub, and pressed it into Isaiah's hand. "Find someone who can keep this safe," she said. "Someone who will know what it means." Isaiah hesitated. "They'll come for you. The law will protect them, not you." She smiled faintly. "Then let them come. A lie can live a long time, but not forever, not when the dead still whisper." He nodded, tucking the page inside his coat. "I'll see it done." They parted there, Isaiah vanishing into the alleys of Charleston, and the sisters disappearing down a back road that led toward Savannah. None of them looked back. Behind them, the plantation burned in memory, even after the smoke cleared, its name erased from records, its lands sold under false heirs. The widow of Charleston became a ghost story told in whispers, a tale of a cursed woman who tried to breed perfection and instead gave birth to damnation. Years passed. The war came and went. Empires shifted, plantations fell, and the old aristocracy crumbled under the weight of its own sins. But sometimes, on humid nights, when the air was thick with the smell of the marsh, travelers along the Ashley River would swear they saw a faint glow where the Tane estate once stood, a light that flickered like a candle seen through fog, pulsing as if from a heartbeat buried underground. Those who ventured close enough claimed to hear faint voices carried on the wind, a woman's weeping, a child's cry, and a whisper that sounded like words written in ash. The blood remembers. Decades later, a historian in Charleston discovered a sealed envelope inside an old church wall. The parchment inside was brittle, but the ink still legible. Across the top was scrawled a single title, "The Record of the Tane Plantation." Below it were names, dates, and accounts so detailed that the historian refused to publish them, claiming they were too grotesque to be true. The document vanished soon after, stolen from the archives. Some say the descendants of those born in that house still live, unaware of the blood that runs through them. Others say the widow's line ended that night, her name erased by fire and shame. But truth has its own kind of immortality. It lingers in forgotten pages, in the echoes of nightmares, in the unease that settles when people speak her name. Eleanor Tane believed she could perfect humanity by controlling the blood. What she never understood was that blood remembers. And it rebels. It carries not just lineage, but the memory of pain. The widow of Charleston thought she was shaping eternity. In the end, she only proved that no empire built on suffering survives the sunrise. Charleston rebuilt itself quickly, as all cities born of pride do. By the late 1800s, the Tane plantation had been parceled into smaller estates, its ruins swallow, wed by ivy and silence. New families moved onto the land, ignorant of its history, planting gardens where the breeding house once stood, building verandas above the old foundation stones. They marveled at how fertile the soil was, how quickly flowers grew, how vines crept up walls overnight, how birds avoided the grove beyond the marsh. They didn't know that the earth beneath them was fed by more than rain. Local children told stories about the widow's ghost walking the fields at dusk, her silhouette gliding through the fog, her face hidden behind a black veil. They said she carried a ledger in her hands and stopped by the river every night to count her missing. Adults laughed at the tales, but none of them stayed long in those houses. Something about the air there felt wrong, thick, heavy, listening. By the turn of the century, the land was abandoned again. Vines strangled the old gates, and the marsh reclaimed what civilization had borrowed. But even then, the curse lingered, not as a haunting of ghosts, but as a pattern repeating itself in blood. Records show that in 1904, a physician named Dr. Alistair Crane purchased the land for a private sanatorium. He was fascinated by heredity, by racial science, and by the same pseudo-theories that once seduced Eleanor Tane. He reopened the surviving basement of the mansion, calling it a research facility. Locals called it the New Infirmary. Within 5 years, his experiments were exposed: forced sterilizations, selective pairings, medical violations cloaked in progress. The parallels were unmistakable. He had found fragments of Eleanor's journals preserved in the walls and believed himself her successor. When the state seized the property, Crane disappeared. Some said he drowned himself in the marsh. Others whispered that the widow came for him. Generations passed. Wars came and went. Charleston grew modern. Electric lights, automobiles, tourists seeking history sanitized for comfort. Yet the stories persisted. In the libraries, books about the region's plantations carried one empty line where the Tane estate should have been listed. No coordinates, no dates, no photographs. It was as if the place had been erased by collective will. But erasure is not cleansing. It is concealment. And what is concealed always waits. In 1932, a young journalist named Henry Lawton, researching forgotten estates, discovered a map that marked the original Tane property. Intrigued by the absence of records, he traveled there during the summer, documenting his findings in a series of letters. The last one, dated August 18th, was found on his desk after he vanished. It read, "I believe I've found it. The earth here breathes. When you walk across the fields, the ground shifts underfoot as if exhaling. I uncovered the corner of a stone foundation, the cellar perhaps, and the smell was unlike anything I have ever known. Sweet at first, then metallic. There are markings inside, carved into the stone, a symbol of a serpent eating its tail, and beneath it the initials E.T. I thought it superstition, but at night the air fills with a sound like weeping, low and endless. I can't tell if it comes from the marsh or the house itself. Tomorrow I will dig deeper." He was never seen again. The authorities blamed quicksand. Locals knew better. The papers called it hysteria. The clergy called it punishment. But among Charleston's older families, the story passed quietly from mouth to mouth, of the land that devoured the curious, of a widow whose name was struck from every register because her sin was too close to the truth. By the late 20th century, developers attempted to reclaim the area, intending to build a luxury resort. During excavation, workers uncovered fragments of porcelain, rusted surgical tools, and bones, hundreds of them, small, fragile, unmistakably human. The project was halted indefinitely. The investors vanished behind corporate silence. The newspapers printed one short paragraph. Remains of uncertain origin discovered in former plantation district. Investigation pending. The investigation never concluded, and yet, even now, the curse endures, not as ghosts dragging chains through hallways, but as something quieter and far more persistent. The echo of ideology. The same logic that justified Eleanor Taine's experiments, the worship of purity, the obsession with hierarchy, the dehumanization disguised as order, never truly died. It simply changed its language, its uniforms, its tools. It moved from ledgers to laboratories, from plantations to policies. The blood remembers, the land remembers. The systems built on both continue to breathe through history's polished mask. And every time humanity convinces itself that control is virtue, that progress requires sacrifice, the widow's shadow flickers back to life. She is not a ghost bound to her house. She is a thought bound to the human mind, the belief that dominance equals divinity. Sometimes on humid nights, the marsh still glows faintly blue. Locals say it's swamp gas. Scientists agree. But those who stand there long enough swear the light pulses in rhythm, like a heartbeat. If you listen carefully, you might hear the faint sound of a woman's pen scratching against paper, as if she never stopped writing. Eleanor Taine's house may have burned, her daughters may have fled, but the curse she birthed survives in every place where human worth is measured in bloodlines, wealth, or obedience. The curse is not hers alone. It is ours. Because the widow of Charleston was not just a woman. She was a mirror. They say history doesn't repeat itself. It whispers, it adjusts its mask, it wears new language and waits for recognition. The story of the widow of Charleston is not simply a southern ghost tale, not merely an account of cruelty and madness buried under magnolia trees and aristocratic manners. It is a record of what happens when human beings mistake control for creation. What Eleanor Taine built was not a plantation or a laboratory. It was a philosophy of ownership stretched to its final, logical horror. She believed that life itself could be improved by hierarchy, that suffering could be sanctified if it served order, that the right blood could excuse every crime. That idea did not die with her. It never does. It crawls through generations, changing its language to suit new ages. It calls itself progress, science, patriotism, faith, destiny. It hides behind statistics and laws and academic papers. It hides behind uniforms, behind borders, behind polished corporate slogans that promise efficiency. It hides even behind kindness, whispering that order is mercy. And every time we forget where such reasoning leads, we return, in another form, on another plantation, with different instruments, but the same intent. There is a reason her house burned. It wasn't divine punishment. It was correction, the physical expression of something deeper, trying to purge itself from the human heart. Fire does not care about names or bloodlines. It consumes illusions until only truth remains. That is why every empire built on the suffering of others eventually falls to ash. The universe has a way of restoring balance that no law, no religion, no ideology can resist forever. When you hear stories like this, it is easy to recoil, to push them away as relics of another time, another people. But that reaction is exactly how such darkness survives. It doesn't need belief. It only needs distance. It thrives in the spaces where we say, that could never be us. It feeds on denial. The truth is that every person who builds systems, nations, churches, companies, even families, faces the same temptation Eleanor Taine did, the urge to decide who deserves to exist and who does not. Her daughters carried that curse in different ways. Caroline sought redemption in control, Josephine in truth, Beatrice in rebellion. Each of them inherited a fragment of her, the intellect, the will, the pride, the guilt. And each learned that freedom without conscience is just another form of slavery. The blood they escaped from that night was not only their mother's, it was the pattern of thought that had raised them. Generations later, historians argue whether the widow of Charleston ever truly existed. Some say she was an amalgam of rumors from the antebellum South, a cautionary myth. Others insist her journals were real, confiscated, hidden in private collections, cited by eugenicists who came decades after her death. But in the end, whether she was real or not matters less than why the story refuses to die. Legends endure when they reveal something the world is still too frightened to face. We are not haunted by ghosts. We are haunted by repetition. And if you've listened this far, if you've followed her story down into the marrow of its darkness, then understand this. The curse of the widow is not some supernatural affliction waiting in the swamps of South Carolina. It is a reflection waiting inside every human institution that values power over empathy. When a man believes he is chosen to rule, he becomes Eleanor. When a government decides who is worthy of life, it becomes her house. When progress demands silence from the weak, her ledger reopens. The ashes of her estate may have scattered long ago, but the philosophy that built it still lives in boardrooms, laboratories, and political speeches. It lives wherever we measure worth by profit, purity, or performance. It lives wherever we confuse control with order and obedience with peace. The moral is not comfort, it is confrontation. Every generation must choose whether to repeat her sin or end it. We do not inherit guilt. We inherit the opportunity to break the pattern. And that requires more than outrage. It requires vigilance. It requires seeing the widow not as a monster from the past, but as a warning of what we become when empathy is erased from power. So if you've felt uneasy through this story, if something in you tightened with every revelation, don't dismiss it as fear. That feeling is recognition. Somewhere in your blood, in the long memory of humanity, you've seen this before. In another name, another flag, another century. The lesson of the widow of Charleston is not that evil hides in the dark. It's that it hides in daylight, dressed in reason, speaking softly about duty and improvement. And the only way to end her curse is to refuse her logic, to look at the world, the systems we serve, and say aloud the truth she could never bear to face. Life is not ours to perfect. It is only ours to protect. That is how her story ends, not with vengeance, but with awareness. Not with ghosts, but with mirrors. Because the widow of Charleston was never buried in South Carolina's soil. She lives in the hearts of those who think control is creation. She dies only when we remember that compassion is the truest power. Long pause, voice softens. If you've heard her story and understood it, if something in you shifted, then write it in the comments below. The blood remembers, twice. Because by saying it, you break the silence that fed her curse. And maybe, just maybe, you help the dead rest at last.